You thought Washington couldn't get any more shameless? Well, think again. Joe Biden, the commander-in-chief in name only, let's be honest, the man is running on fumes, just handed the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Hillary Clinton. Biden awarding anything named after freedom is rich enough, but Hillary? That's like giving a vegan a lifetime supply of steak dinners. And get this, Biden's not done. He also dished out the same award to George Soros, the king of global meddling and a man who treats freedom like it's an annoying speed bump on his road to control. This isn't just a slap in the face to actual champions of freedom, it's a full-on demolition derby. Biden, who's about as coherent as a magic 8-ball these days, is handing out medals like candy to people who've built their careers dismantling the very freedoms this country stands for. Clinton and Soros are the establishment dream team, the career politician and the billionaire puppet master united in their love for power and disdain for the pesky little thing called liberty. Let's dig into this farce and expose how freedom has become just another punchline in Washington's never-ending joke. Starting with the moment in question, Hillary being awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Biden.
Hillary Rodham Clinton is guided by the Methodist Creed, do all the good you can, in all the ways you can. As a lawyer, she defended the rights of children. As First Lady, she fought for universal health care and declared women's rights are human rights. As Senator, she helped New York rebuild after September 11, 2001. As Secretary of State, she championed democracy worldwide, and her nomination for president broke barriers and inspired generations. Through it all, her career has been dedicated to an eternal truth. America's ideals are sacred, and we must always defend and live by them.
All right, well, let's sharpen the lens and address the specifics of Hillary Clinton's glowing Medal of Freedom citation. The speech begins with a grand gesture. She's guided by the Methodist Creed, do all the good you can in all the ways you can. A noble sentiment, but in practice, it seems Hillary's interpretation of good often aligns more with personal gain than with any meaningful advancement of freedom or democracy. They kick things off by praising her as a lawyer who defended the rights of children. This conveniently sidesteps one of her most controversial cases in 1975, where she defended Thomas Alfred Taylor, a 41-year-old man accused of raping a 12-year-old girl. According to court records and audio recordings uncovered by the Washington Free Beacon in 2014, Clinton laughed during an interview while recounting how she got Taylor to plead to a lesser charge after questioning the reliability of forensic evidence. She described how a polygraph test that Taylor passed forever destroyed my faith in polygraphs. Let's be clear, every defendant is entitled to legal representation, but laughing about a case involving the brutalization of a child hardly aligns with the image of a lifelong champion of children's rights. Then there's her time as first celebrated for fighting for universal health care. Yes, she spearheaded the Clinton administration's health care reform efforts in the early 90s, but what's left out is the backlash she caused by her secretive working group, which operated behind closed doors without public or congressional input. According to the New York Times, her approach alienated allies and created significant opposition, ultimately dooming the plan. Hardly a model of democratic transparency, but not unexpected for the left. Next, they praise her for helping New York rebuild after 9/11. While she did vote for recovery aid, she also backed the USA Patriot Act, which significantly expanded government surveillance powers and infringed on civil liberties. Groups like the ACLU criticized the law for its overreach, warning it eroded fundamental freedoms under the guise of national security. So while New York saw some aid, America was saddled with the infrastructure for mass surveillance, which we still have to deal with to this day. So thanks, Hillary. That's a whole hell of a lot of freedom if I've ever seen any. Anyway, as Secretary of State, she's lauded for championing democracy worldwide. This is almost an Orwellian twist. Under her leadership, the U.S. spearheaded the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya, which the Washington Post described as a destabilizing disaster. The intervention left Libya in chaos, created a power vacuum exploited by extremists, and led to a humanitarian crisis. Clinton's flippant, "we came, we saw, we died" comment about Gaddafi's death only underscored her cavalier attitude toward the consequences of her decisions. But I guess her neocon jumped out in that moment. She couldn't just hold that witch in. And let's not forget her infamous email scandal. According to the FBI, Clinton used a private server for classified government communications while serving as Secretary of State, a move FBI Director James Comey called extremely careless. Mishandling classified information isn't just irresponsible, it's a direct threat to national security. If that's freedom, it's news to the rest of us. Finally, her presidential campaign is framed as a barrier-breaking inspiration, and while her run was historic, it's hard to reconcile her rhetoric about respecting democracy with her refusal to fully accept the results of the 2016 election. According to Politico, Clinton has repeatedly implied the election was stolen through Russian interference and voter suppression, undermining faith in the democratic process. The irony of this rhetoric from someone celebrated as a champion of democracy is almost too much to bear, especially when you consider that she's the one who paid for the Steele dossier, the Oppo research that ended up turning into a 4-year FBI investigation, tens of millions of dollars, which ended up proving that there was no truth to it. And yet state media and their establishment Democrat cronies ran with that story for literally years. All in all, this Medal of Freedom feels less like recognition of a defender of liberty and more like a participation trophy for someone whose career has consistently prioritized power over principles. If Hillary Clinton's record is the benchmark for freedom, then the word itself has been rendered meaningless. But then again, the man awarding her the medal is pretty much brain dead, so I guess it's par for the course at this point. But that's not where all the Hillary Clinton freedom contradictions end. Let's look at a few different sound bites that illustrate just how much Hillary represents freedom. Because if there's anybody who is freedom, it's Hillary. As we all know, she is the definition of freedom.
Does need to mandate vaccines.
By mandate vaccines, you mean what we would call vaccine passports. Insist that people coming into buildings, into clubs, into restaurants show everyone
and
have
employers.
been vaccinated.
I mean, part of what we've done in New York, for example, is all of the big health systems, hospitals and the like, they've mandated vaccines. And so, for example, one very large one, 77,000 employees, 1,000 refused to get vaccinated, they were fired. 1,000 refused to get vaccinated, they were fired. And I think you've got to make it clear that we're not going to go back to lockdown. That is not going to happen. But if you don't get vaccinated, and if you don't have proof of vaccination when you go into a club or a restaurant, and employers don't enforce vaccines, we may see some problems here.
Well, that was straight out of the Twilight Zone back in the COVID era, a time when fear ran the show and reason took a back seat. Many of us, myself included, got swept up in the hysteria. The constant drumbeat of stay home, save lives was so relentless that even the sanest among us started questioning our footing. But hindsight is 2020, and now we can look back and see just how far the left was willing to push the envelope. And nowhere is that more obvious than in Hillary Clinton's statements during the lockdown that we just saw. Her endorsement of vaccine mandates, complete with firings for compliance, is absolutely absurd. She boasted about how hospitals and health systems in New York fired 1,000 employees for refusing to get vaccinated. Fired. People who were frontline workers, heroes during the early uncertain days of the pandemic, suddenly discarded like trash because they wouldn't comply with mandates. Clinton framed this as a necessary measure to avoid another lockdown, but what it really was, and still is, was draconian authoritarianism, pure and simple. 1,000 people lost their jobs not because they were incompetent or unwilling to work, but because they didn't want an experimental vaccine injected into their bodies. And she applauded that. This is the same woman who now holds a Presidential Medal of Freedom, an award ostensibly given to those who champion liberty. Let that sink in. Clinton didn't just tolerate infringing on personal freedoms during the pandemic, she openly endorsed it, mandating vaccines, forcing people to show proof of vaccination just to go into a restaurant or a club, and coercing employers into enforcing these rules. That's not freedom. That's coercion dressed up as public health policy. Her rhetoric during that time relied on fear-based persuasion, a classic appeal to emotion. By framing these measures as necessary to avoid lockdowns, she created a false dichotomy. Either you get vaccinated and follow the rules, or you're responsible for bringing back lockdowns and chaos. It was manipulative, designed to pit people against each other, and it worked. But the truth is, lockdowns and mandates were political decisions, not inevitable outcomes. Suggesting otherwise was a logical fallacy, a slippery slope designed to crush dissent. And let's not forget how easily this set a precedent. If firing people for their personal health choices is acceptable under the guise of public safety, what else becomes fair game? Clinton's endorsement of these measures didn't just chip away at freedom, it dynamited it. Her actions and statements revealed an underlying willingness to sacrifice individual rights for the sake of control. This is the very opposite of what the Medal of Freedom represents. Now, what exposes Hillary's nefarious intent even further is the fallout from these draconian mandates that the establishment does want to admit. Let's start with vaccine injuries. According to the CDC's Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, there have been over 1.5 million reports of adverse events following COVID-19 vaccination in the United States alone as of late 2024. These include over 36,000 deaths and hundreds of thousands of reports of severe reactions like myocarditis, pericarditis, and blood clots. While the system doesn't prove causation, the volume of reports is staggering and unprecedented compared to other vaccines. Countries like Denmark and Norway have since restricted the use of certain mRNA vaccines, particularly for young age groups, citing risks of heart inflammation. Japan has gone even further, labeling COVID vaccines with warnings about potential side effects and emphasizing individual choice, a stark contrast to the coercive measures Hillary Clinton endorsed. Then there's the economic and social toll of these mandates, which came crashing down when institutions started to backpedal. Take Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States. After firing thousands of employees for refusing to comply with vaccine mandates, some of whom had served on the front lines during the pandemic, they quietly tried to rehire many of those same workers. Why? According to reports in the Washington Post and Forbes, Kaiser admitted they were pressured by federal, state, and local politicians to enforce these mandates, even when internal leadership expressed concerns about the ethics and long-term consequences of firing workers. The sudden reversal was framed as a staffing shortage issue, but the reality is that public backlash and legal challenges exposed the overreach. At the end of the day, these mandates weren't just about health. They were a power play, and the long-term effects are undeniable. Terminated workers faced financial ruin, mental health challenges, and permanent career disruptions. Meanwhile, governments and corporations that enforce these policies are now scrambling to shift the blame, claiming they were pressured into these decisions. Clinton's cheerleading for these actions during the pandemic, framing them as necessary for public safety, only highlights her willingness to prioritize control over compassion and freedom. So the data doesn't lie. The mandates cause harm, vaccine injuries are real and significant, and countries are walking back their initial support for these measures. Yet here we are handing out medals for freedom to someone who celebrated these draconian policies. The contrast is jarring and exposes just how warped our values have become when it comes to who we honor and why. Clinton's legacy during the pandemic isn't one of leadership or freedom. It's one of fear-mongering, coercion, and harm. And no medal can rewrite that history. But believe it or not, it goes even further than that, because one of the freedoms that we value the most in America, enshrined in our First Amendment, is the freedom of speech. And let's say what the Medal of Freedom recipient Hillary Clinton has to say about that.
And boosting Trump back in 2016. But I also think there are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda. And whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrence.
So in case you missed it, folks, what we just saw is Hillary Clinton, the self-proclaimed champion of democracy, suggesting that Americans spreading what she deems propaganda, a conveniently broad and subjective term, should face civil or even criminal charges. This isn't some outdated soundbite from 2016, by the way, or a poorly aged pandemic-era comment, as we just saw. No, this was September 2024. Hillary Clinton, less than 4 months ago, openly advocated punishing Americans for exercising their First Amendment rights. The same person now draped in accolades for her supposed dedication to liberty is championing a playbook that sounds like it was ripped straight out of Orwell. If irony were an Olympic sport, she'd have the gold. Now let's break this down. Clinton frames her remarks as part of the fight against Russian disinformation, which at first glance seems like a reasonable concern. After all, foreign interference in American democracy is a legitimate issue. But here's the bait and switch. She doesn't stop at addressing foreign actors. Instead, she drags Americans into the mix, saying some citizens might deserve criminal charges for their role in spreading what she calls propaganda. This rhetorical sleight of hand capitalizes on fear of foreign threats to justify cracking down on domestic dissent. What Clinton is proposing isn't about protecting democracy. It's about controlling it. That's not leadership. It's authoritarianism dressed as patriotism. And let's be clear, her entire argument hinges on a logical fallacy, guilt by association. By linking Americans to supposed Russian efforts, she implies that anyone challenging the establishment narrative is either complicit or acting in bad faith. It's intellectually dishonest, dangerous, and antithetical to the principles of free speech. The First Amendment isn't conditional on government approval, and yet Clinton is advocating policies that could criminalize dissent under the guise of national security. If that doesn't terrify you, it should. And speaking of disinformation, let's talk about Clinton's own track record. Her obsession with Russian propaganda traces back to the Steele dossier debacle, a boondoggle that her campaign partially funded through the Democrat National Committee and law firm Perkins Coie. According to the Washington Post, the dossier, a collection of salacious and unverified claims about Donald Trump, was created by former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele and later fed to the FBI as credible intelligence. The result? A multi-year investigation that cost taxpayers an estimated $32 million, according to the Department of Justice's Inspector General. The kicker, the dossier was largely debunked. The Mueller report and subsequent investigations revealed that many of its claims were either unsubstantiated or outright false, and the FBI faced harsh criticism for relying on it to obtain FISA warrants. Now, not only did this fiasco fail to uncover any meaningful collusion between Trump and Russia, but it also eroded public trust in institutions like the FBI and the DOJ. The Steele dossier was more than a political dirty trick. It became the foundation for a media and political frenzy that wasted millions of dollars and countless hours of national attention. If spreading propaganda is a crime, Hillary Clinton might want to reconsider her own track record, because the Steele dossier is textbook disinformation, bought, paid for, and disseminated by her own allies. Then there's the hypocrisy of Clinton painting herself as a defender of democracy. This is the same person who referred to millions of Americans as a basket of deplorables and has repeatedly questioned the legitimacy of the 2016 election, blaming everything from James Comey to Russian interference for her loss. According to Politico, Clinton has consistently pushed the narrative that the election was stolen, undermining faith in the democratic process she claims to champion. And now, just months ago, she proposed punishing Americans for engaging in the kind of speech she doesn't like. This isn't about protecting democracy. It's very clear that for the Clintons, it's about consolidating power. In the end, Clinton's rhetoric about Russian propaganda isn't just hypocritical, it's dangerous. By advocating criminal charges for subjective interpretations of speech, she's setting a precedent that could erode the very freedoms the Medal of Freedom is meant to honor. Her track record, from the Steele dossier to her divisive rhetoric, makes it clear that her commitment to democracy extends only as far as it serves her interests. The irony of awarding her a Medal of Freedom for this is almost too much to bear. Now, all that being said, in case you're still doubtful that she deserved that Medal of Freedom, here's another clip to hopefully bring you to the light.
We should be, in my view, repealing something called Section 230, which gave, platforms on the internet immunity because they were thought to be just pass-throughs, that they shouldn't be judged for the content that is posted. But we now know that that was an overly simple view, that if the platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter X or Instagram or TikTok, whatever they are, if they don't moderate and monitor the content, we lose total control. And it's not just the social and psychological effects, it's real harm.
Hillary Clinton, always a beacon of honesty when she doesn't mean to be. This time, she said the quiet part out loud, and it's a doozy. In a single breath, she managed to lay bare the left's obsession with controlling the narrative, openly admitting that platforms like Facebook, X, and TikTok must moderate and monitor content, or else we lose total control. I guess her Hitler slipped out. Total control, folks. Not we lose the ability to facilitate dialogue, or we lose a chance to fact check harmful content. No. What she's really afraid of is losing the iron grip her party and its allies have over the public conversation. Let's dissect this rhetorical slip, shall we? Clinton uses what's known as a slippery slope argument, implying that without strict content moderation, society will devolve into chaos. It's going to be pure anarchy. You're not going to believe it. It's so scary. But the real fear isn't chaos. It's dissent. She frames this as a battle against real harm, a vague and emotionally charged phrase designed to stoke fear without defining specifics. What kind of harm harm? Misinformation, offended sensibilities, or perhaps the harm of people daring to question you, the establishment? This rhetorical tactic is classic fear-mongering, meant to justify sweeping censorship under the guise of public safety. And her solution? Repealing Section 230. According to her, platforms should no longer be considered neutral pass-throughs of information, but instead held accountable for everything posted. On the surface, this might sound reasonable to someone unfamiliar with how the internet works. But here's a kicker. Removing Section 230 protections would force these platforms to either over-censor to avoid liability or shut down controversial speech entirely. In other words, goodbye free expression. The irony is rich. Clinton, the supposed champion of democracy, wants to undermine one of the fundamental pillars of it, open dialogue. Now let's add some context here. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is what allows platforms to host user-generated content without being legally responsible for every post, tweet, and comment. It's not a free pass for platforms to spread harmful content, as Clinton claims. It's the foundation of the modern internet, enabling innovation, connection, and yes, freedom of speech. Without it, platforms would face lawsuits for anything remotely controversial, leading to either extreme censorship or the collapse of smaller platforms that can't afford the legal risks. This isn't a theoretical concern. Tech experts across the political spectrum, from the Electronic Frontier Foundation to TechDirt, have warned about the chilling effect repealing Section 230 would have. But Clinton doesn't care about fostering a healthier online environment. Her focus is clear: control the narrative at all costs. Her fear of losing total control isn't just a Freudian slip, it's a window into the left's strategy. They know that when people can freely share ideas, challenge authority, and organize against policies they find oppressive, the establishment loses its grip. Clinton's statement isn't about protecting society, it's about protecting her team's monopoly on truth. And let's not forget the hypocrisy. Clinton herself has benefited from platforms that allowed her allies to shape narratives favorable to her. Remember the Steele dossier we just spoke about a couple of minutes ago? As the Washington Post reported, her campaign helped fund the unverified document that was spread across social media outlets and social platforms as though it were gospel truth. Where was her concern about real harm then? Oh, right. It wasn't harm. It was strategy. You got to do anything you can do when it comes to winning presidential elections. Just ask Hillary Clinton. In the end, Clinton's comments expose what many of us have long suspected. This isn't about democracy, safety, or truth. It's about power, pure and simple. The left doesn't fear misinformation. They fear information they can't control. And in a rare moment of candor, Hillary Clinton told us exactly that. So the next time she waxes poetic about championing democracy, freedom, remember, her idea of democracy is a rigged game, and her idea of harm is you having the audacity to speak your mind. So here we are, folks, trying to make sense of this Kafka-esque nightmare. Hillary Clinton, the reigning queen of censorship, coercion, and political theater, just snagged the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Freedom! For a woman who spent her career treating that word like a punchline. It's like giving the Nobel Prize to a warlord. Oh wait, yeah, that's right. We've done that before. This isn't just ironic, it's a slap in the face to every ordinary American who actually values liberty. Clinton didn't earn this medal through a life of defending freedom. She earned it through a life of stomping on it with the grace of a bull in a china shop. This award isn't about celebrating democracy. It's about the establishment giving itself a standing ovation while the rest of us are left footing the bill. Hillary Clinton's career is a greatest hits album of everything wrong with politics. She's the political version of Hotel California. You think it can't get worse, and then another verse comes along. From laughing about defending an accused child rapist to the Steele dossier debacle that cost taxpayers $32 million and delivered nothing but partisan chaos, Clinton's legacy is built on wreckage. And let's not forget her pandemic cheerleading for vaccine mandates and firings, or her September 2024 confession about fearing the loss of total control over the public narrative. Imagine being so terrified of people having opinions that you propose measures that unequivocally oppose one of the foundational freedoms of this country, a freedom that the founders thought to be so important, they put it down first in our Constitution. This isn't a woman fighting for any freedom whatsoever. This is a woman fighting for her brand of obedience. And now the political elites are pinning a medal on her chest for it. You can't make this up. So seriously, what does this medal mean anymore? Is it a trophy for liberty, or is it just a participation ribbon for playing the game? How does someone who openly advocates for censorship, mandates, and narrative control become the face of freedom? Are we handing out medals for irony now? Because if so, this one takes the gold. What's next? A medal of honor honor for lobbyists. This isn't a celebration of democracy. It's a mockery of it. It's the left spitting in the face of ordinary Americans, reminding us that the rules don't apply to them. They break our systems, silence dissent, and they reward themselves for it while telling us it's for our own good. It's dark, it's twisted, and it's exactly what we've come to expect from the elites. The question is, how much longer are we willing to sit here and applaud them? Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.